And that's what he did that day. He consumed all the buildings.
So the chemistry doesn't lie.
Right.
This proves that there was a building here. These are not just geological formations.
Yes, it's a testament, to what happened there.
For most people, Sodom and Gomorrah are just lines in an old book, a story about fire from heaven that feels like legend. But what if there really is a place by the Dead Sea where stone cities turn to ash and millions of sulfur balls still lie frozen in the ground?
We actually found sulfur balls, these spheres of sulfur, and where they had completely burned up, there was a cavity very similar.
One explorer claimed he walked through those ruins and held their evidence in his hands. If he is even partly right, what is that silent valley trying to tell us about judgment, mercy, and our own time? The day the road ran through the ruins. Long before Ron Wyatt ever thought about Sodom and Gomorrah, he was already obsessed with the old stories. He chased what he believed to be the resting place of Noah's Ark in the mountains of Turkey. He traced the path of the Exodus across the desert, and he drove dusty roads again and again to reach what he thought was the real Red Sea crossing. Every trip to that crossing site forced him to pass through the same stretch of land on the eastern side of the Dead Sea, near the ancient region of Zoar, a place the Bible itself connects with the cities of the plain. At first, it was just a landmark on the way to somewhere more important. The road cut through pale cliffs and strange mounds that looked different from the ordinary rock around them. Season after season, he would slow the vehicle, point out the soft, pale material to his sons and the workers who traveled with him, and tell them that this might be all that was left of Sodom and Gomorrah and the other cities of the valley. From a distance, the formations looked like eroded hills. Up close, they revealed straight lines, right angles, and structure, shapes that suggested streets and walls melted down into something fragile. When Wyatt and his family climbed out and walked across the surface, they were not crunching on gravel. The ground under their feet felt like compressed powder. Walls that should have been rock crumbled in their hands. When they picked up chunks of the material and squeezed, it turned to a white dust that stuck to their fingers and clothes. This was not ordinary limestone. It was ash, and not just a thin coating. In places, the ash ran several feet deep, layered and uniform, as if an entire city had been reduced to powder and then frozen in place. Ash like that does not come from a small campfire or a passing grass blaze. The powder in those cliffs is the kind produced when stone and brick are exposed to temperatures beyond what normal flames can reach. Ron would later point out that it takes heat beyond 2,000 degrees to leave that kind of residue. Whatever burned here did not just scorch buildings, it stripped them down to their chemistry. If the Bible's description of fire and brimstone meant anything physical at all, this strange white landscape seemed like a match. So was this an overworked imagination seeing shapes in clouds, or had this routine drive been taking him through the skeleton of the very cities he had grown up reading about? If this really is not just a strange landscape, but the melted outline of a lost city, what kind of evidence could prove that beyond anyone's opinion? Cities turned to powder. On later visits, Ron and his wife Marinelle explored the area more carefully. Walking along ridges and gullies, they began to notice patterns that were hard to dismiss. The pale cliffs, when viewed from the right angle, suggested the outlines of city blocks and defensive walls. There were sections that curved like old towers, others that lined up like streets. None of it was solid stone. Everywhere they pressed, the substance collapsed into the same soft powder. This was not a random ash dump or volcanic deposit. It looked like architecture that had been cooked until every beam, brick and stone had lost its identity. The color was a dead giveaway. Ordinary rock in the region carries streaks of brown, red and gray. These formations were almost ghost white, with only faint shading where wind and rain had carved channels. When they broke pieces open, the inside matched the outside, a uniform ash from surface to core. It behaved like something that had gone through a single intense event, rather than a slow, natural process. In modern fires, even concrete will usually leave behind recognizable chunks. Here, there was nothing but fragile shapes that still held the memory of buildings, yet disintegrated at a touch. The more time they spent among the ruins, the more Ron was convinced that this had been a living valley. The Bible describes Sodom and the surrounding cities as rich and well-watered, a place where Lot chose to live precisely because of its prosperity. That made the contrast even more jarring. Where there had once been fields, livestock, houses and markets, there was now a silent scene of grey whiteness with no trees, no life and no obvious landmarks except the faint imprint of a city frozen in decay. If judgment had a physical form, this is what it might look like. Yet there was one detail that troubled them. The ash shapes seemed too perfect to be only the result of fire. In many places there were little circular scars dotting the surfaces, like pockmarks in the powder. At first they thought these might be from stones that had weathered out or from animals digging. It was not until a simple accident revealed what lay hidden inside that the puzzle of those markings began to open, and with it the most disturbing piece of evidence Ron Wyatt ever claimed to find on that burned-out plain. What could be hiding inside an ash city that had been sitting under the Middle Eastern sun for thousands of years, and why did the shape of one broken fragment remind his wife of an eyeball staring back at her from the dust? If the very streets and walls have been cooked into powder, what else might still be hiding inside those ash shapes that survived the fire itself, frozen fire in the walls? It was during one of these trips in the late 1980s that Marinelle picked up a chunk of the pale material that had cracked open along a ledge. Inside the fracture, she noticed a small round cavity that looked strangely like an eye socket, smooth and circular with a darker rim around the edge. It was easy to shrug off as coincidence, yet the image stayed with them. A year later, while examining other pieces with similar pits, Ron finally dug into one of the circular scars instead of just noting it and moving on. What he found inside was not hollow space. Embedded in the ash was a round pebble of soft yellowish material. When he pried it out with his knife, it gave under the blade far more than stone should. The closer he brought it to his nose, the more the smell became impossible to ignore. It smelled like burnt matches and minerals from hot springs. He tasted a tiny flake on the tip of his tongue and recognized the bitterness. This was sulfur. Not sulfur mixed in rock, but nearly pure sulfur in the form of a ball, sealed inside an ash shell. As he and his companions began to examine more of the circular markings, they found the pattern repeated. Some cavities were empty, but many still held these pale spheres. In places where the balls had burned away completely, the inner walls of the pit were turned black, as if that spot had become a miniature furnace. Where the spheres remained intact, they could be removed and weighed. There were thousands upon thousands of them scattered throughout the deposits, each one a little bomb of combustible material, as if fire had rained down in pellets and bored itself into whatever it struck. In one demonstration, Ron cut into a fresh patch on camera. Before he used the knife, its blade was sharp and clean. By the time he had carved out a sulfur pebble, it was scorched and dulled. The material resisted in a way that ordinary chalky stone did not. When he lit one of the spheres, it burned with a fierce blue flame, giving off choking fumes that drove him and his crew back. These were not fossilized shells or ordinary geological nodules. They were fuel, trapped inside the very stuff he believed had once been houses, streets, and city squares. Ron pointed viewers back to the biblical wording. The account in Genesis describes the Lord raining down fire and brimstone on Sodom and Gomorrah. The ancient word, often translated as brimstone, refers to burning sulfur. In his mind, the translation from text to terrain was simple. Spheres of sulfur had fallen at irregular intervals over the cities, igniting wherever they landed. Each pellet would have burned hot enough to turn wood, stone, and flesh into ash. The shells and cavities left behind were the scars of that storm, still visible thousands of years later. Skeptics argue that sulfur deposits and ash layers can form naturally, that erosion can carve odd shapes, and that human eyes are quick to see patterns where none exist. Those objections matter, but they do not erase the unsettling sight of entire hills of powder laced with sulfur capsules that can still be lit. If this is all coincidence, it is a dense one. If it is not coincidence, then those millions of frozen fireballs are more than a curiosity. They are physical echoes of a night when, according to the Bible, an entire civilization was erased in a single wave of judgment. If millions of frozen sulfur bombs still sit in the ruins, what does that say about the night they first fell and the people who lived beneath that storm? The night. The cities went blind. To understand why Ron Wyatt believed his discovery mattered, you have to go back to the story that shaped his expectations. In the book of Genesis, the cities of the plain are not random villages. They are centers of wealth and corruption, places where people had turned so far from God that their cruelty and immorality had become a cry reaching heaven. Into that darkness, two angels came in human form and stayed in the house of a man named Lot, Abraham's nephew, who had chosen to live there because the land looked good for his flocks. The reaction of the city exposed its rot. Men surrounded Lot's house and demanded that he bring out his guests so they could abuse them. Lot, in confusion and fear, tried to protect the visitors in ways that shock us today, which only proves that his sense of right and wrong had been shaped by his surroundings. The crowd pressed harder. Only then did the angels act openly. The account says they reached out, pulled Lot inside, and struck the men at the door with blindness so that they groped around, worn out as they tried to find the entrance. For years, Ron had read that verse and pictured a simple miracle, a beam of power from God that removed sight from the mob. When he looked more closely at the text, he realized something subtle. It does not say that God directly blinded them. It says the angels did, operating with the authority and power given to them. If messengers could selectively block the perception of people who were inches from a door, he reasoned, then perhaps the same kind of spiritual interference could keep drivers and tourists from noticing an ash city by the highway until the right time. To Ron, this was not just about punishment. The same passage that tells of destruction also tells of mercy almost to the point of frustration. The angels urged Lot to gather his family and leave. His sons-in-law laughed at him. His wife hesitated and looked back, and the story says she became a pillar of salt, frozen in the very landscape she could not let go. Lot himself stumbled and delayed until the angels practically dragged him out of the city. It was as if heaven was bending over backward to save a man who was only partially loyal. That contrast stayed at the center of Ron's message whenever he spoke about Sodom and Gomorrah. Yes, there was fire. Yes, there was ash. But there was also a rescue. In his view, the ruins near the Dead Sea are not only a record of how fierce judgment can be, they are also a reminder of how far God will go to pull even halting, compromised people out of the way when that judgment falls. The question he kept posing beneath his archaeological claims was simple. If God could hide a door from a violent mob and hide an entire valley of ruins from travelers, what might he be hiding from us now? Until the moment we most need to see it, ashes. As a warning. When Ron stood on those pale ridges, he did not just see geology. He saw a sermon written in minerals. The Bible does not leave Sodom and Gomorrah buried in Genesis as a one-time event. Later books hold them up as examples. The letter of Jude describes the cities of the plain as an example of what awaits those who live in continual rebellion, speaking of them as suffering the punishment of eternal fire. The emphasis is not on flames that never go out, but on a final result that cannot be reversed. Prophets picked up the same imagery. In the book of Ezekiel, God tells the rebellious spiritual power we know as Satan that he will be brought to ashes upon the earth in the sight of those who look on. The prophet Malachi pictures a day when the arrogant and all who do evil become like stubble, burned so completely that the righteous walk on the ashes under their feet. Whether you take every line literally or see part of it as picture language, the point is hard to escape. In the biblical story, wickedness has a real end, and that end is not disciplined reform. It is removal. That is why the idea of entire cities reduced to ash matters so much in Ron's telling. On Mount Carmel, when Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal, the fire that fell from heaven did not stop at burning the sacrificial animal. The text says it consumed the wood, the stones of the altar, and even the water in a trench around it. Nothing remained but scorched ground. If divine fire could do that to a small altar, what would it do to an entire valley of stone buildings and living beings? The powdery cities near the Dead Sea answer that question with an eerie silence. Ron was careful to remind his audiences that if his identification is correct, no one is going to find skeletons, furniture, or coins in those ruins. Fire that turns structures into ash does not leave artifacts for museums. What it leaves is a landscape that whispers of something terrible and final. In his view, that is exactly how it should be. Sodom and Gomorrah were never meant to become tourist attractions filled with souvenir stands. They were meant to stand, even in ruins, as a warning that God is patient but not indifferent, merciful yet willing to draw a line. Of course, this is where people become uncomfortable. It is one thing to talk about ancient wickedness under judgment. It is another to ask whether our own generation, with its violence, exploitation, and pride, is very different. When cameras pan across the lifeless grey mounds and the tiny sulfur balls still buried inside, they do more than illustrate an old story. They raise a direct personal question. If the same God who judged that valley is, as Scripture insists, a God who does not change, then what does that mean for a world that keeps repeating the same patterns with better technology and brighter lights? The choice behind the ash. In the end, Ron Wyatt did not present Sodom and Gomorrah merely as an archaeological puzzle. He framed them as part of a larger invitation. According to the first chapter of Genesis, human beings were created in the image of God, meant to reflect his character in how they lived, worked, and treated one another. The story of Sodom is one in which that image is almost unrecognizable. Violence replaces hospitality, lust replaces honor, and the vulnerable are treated as prey. When a society reaches that point in Scripture, judgment is not arbitrary. It is the final consequence of countless choices. Ron often stressed that while entire populations can harden themselves, individuals still have a path out. Lot was far from perfect. He had chosen to live in a corrupt place for practical reasons. Yet, in the end, he listened, however reluctantly, when mercy called him. In the same way, Ron pointed to passages that promise forgiveness and transformation to anyone who will turn back. The New Testament speaks of asking God for the forgiveness of sins and for a changed heart, trusting in the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. In that frame, the ruins are not just a monument to destruction. They are a contrast to what could be. He warned that if people insist on clinging to a way of life that harms and corrupts, if they refuse every offer of grace, then the Bible is clear about the outcome. The same scriptures that describe the preservation of Lot describe the destruction of those who refused to leave the path they were on. The cities of the plains stand as an example, not because God delights in devastation, but because he refuses to let evil stretch on forever without answer. Divine judgment in that sense is not the tantrum of a deity. It is the final defense of what is good. So who is really writing in the ash by the Dead Sea? Is it simply wind and salt and time, carving random shapes into soft deposits? Is it a controversial explorer, seeing what he wants to see? Is it, as Ron believed, the finger of God pointing back to a moment when patience ended and justice fell? Each of those answers carries its own implications. If it is only erosion, then the valley is just another odd landscape. If it is a true warning, then ignoring it is dangerous. Whatever you decide, the image is hard to forget. Entire cities reduced to pale powder that crumbles in your hand, pierced with the yellow marbles of sulfur that can still burn. A road running straight through the remains while drivers speed past, unaware. A story as old as Genesis playing out under the hot sun of the modern Middle East. The ruins cannot speak, but according to Ron Wyatt and to the scriptures he trusted, they do not have to. Their very silence says enough. Maybe you look at Ron Wyatt's claims and feel skeptical. Or maybe you see those ash heaps and sulfur balls and feel a chill because they line up too closely with a story you learned as a child. Either way, the deeper question is the same. If there really is a God who both judges and rescues, where do you stand with him right now? Let us know what you think in the comments. Share this with someone who loves digging into Bible mysteries. And if you want more deep dives into faith, history, and the evidence that connects them, make sure you like this video and subscribe so you do not miss what comes next.